London businessman Martin Copley has set aside $750,000 to buy and develop the 75-hectare block. The bush here is about as pristine as you can get, packed with the food and shelter our native animals need to survive. But they won't stand a chance unless the two big predators are wiped out. Foxes and feral cats. A special predator-proof fence must be built along the perimeter so creatures like Misty can thrive in peace.
It's an investment, isn't it, in the future and in our children's future. I would have thought that's the best sort of investment one can make.
30 years ago, a seed was planted that has led to the formation of one of the most important and significant conservation organisations in the world. Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Australia's unique biodiversity is facing a crisis. Introduced predators like feral cats and foxes, feral herbivores, weeds, mismanaged fire and the impact of a changing climate are driving Australia's wildlife to extinction. Australia already has the worst rate of recent mammal extinctions in the world, and scientists predict more species will become extinct over the coming years unless we take urgent action.
Australia now is the guardian of a unique collection of animals, mammals, birds, insects, flowers, unlike anything else in the world. And it's all in your hands.
Australian Wildlife Conservancy takes a practical, science-based approach to conservation. It's an innovative model that involves working alone or in partnership with pastoralists, Indigenous groups, government, private landholders and universities to deliver the best possible outcomes for wildlife on a vast landscape scale.
That's why AWC is so very important. And science runs through the whole activities of AWC in a most admirable way. There are a lot of ingredients to success in conservation. Part of it, of course, is money. Part of it, of course, is having the area where you can do things. Part of it, of course, is having science behind you. And part of it, of course, is having dedicated people who give their lives to dealing with these problems.
30 years ago, Australian Wildlife Conservancy's founder Martin Copley had a vision to act upon the alarming rate of biodiversity loss in Australia. Over 3 decades, one property in the southwest of Western Australia has led to the creation of Australian Wildlife Conservancy, which now owns, works in partnership or manages 31 sanctuaries spanning more than 6.5 million hectares in some of the most iconic regions in Australia.
Effective fire management, feral predator and herbivore control, weed eradication and the rewilding of endangered species are critical tools in Australian Wildlife Conservancy's conservation toolkit. Australian Wildlife Conservancy also conducts the largest biodiversity monitoring program in Australia. It's a massive effort, but it's vitally important because it allows us to build an inventory of the species that we protect and to measure our progress on the ground. It's the only way we can be sure we're generating the best positive outcomes for wildlife.
As we look back over the last 30 years, we acknowledge our staff, our partners, our volunteers and our wonderful supporters who have helped Australian Wildlife Conservancy grow to be the largest owner and manager of private land for conservation in Australia. We're making great progress. Australian Wildlife Conservancy now protects 74% of Australian mainland mammal species, 88% of native bird species, 55% of reptile species, and 54% of amphibian species across our network of sanctuaries and partnership areas across Australia. Despite our progress, however, across the rest of the continent, Australia's extinction record continues to escalate. 34 mammal species have gone extinct since European settlement. Australia's threatened species list has increased by 36% in the last 15 years. a further 1,800 species of flora and fauna hang by a slender thread. We need to take decisive action now if we're to prevent more species being added to Australia's extinction record. Over the next 30 years, we'll be deploying more ecologists and more land managers in the field at the front line of conservation where they can make the biggest difference for Australia's wildlife. We'll collaborate with more Indigenous groups to help care for country. We'll engage with pastoralists and private landholders to expand our reach. And we'll rewild more threatened species on private and government land. In other words, we're significantly expanding our partnership model in order to achieve the best possible outcomes for our biodiversity. We're rewriting the future for biodiversity in this country. We're providing hope for Australia's threatened wildlife and their habitats, now, for the next 30 years and beyond.
I particularly wanted, ladies and gentlemen, to send my warmest congratulations and gratitude to the Australian Wildlife Conservancy team for their outstanding work over these past 30 years. Their science-based approach and innovative land management practices are making a significant impact in protecting wildlife across Australia. I have now had the great pleasure of being patron of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy for the past 8 years, and God willing, I much look forward to celebrating your wins for Australia's wildlife for many more years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, Australia is the most remarkable country, with some of our planet's most unique flora and fauna. A land of harsh environments and vast landscapes has produced an array of wildlife akin to no other found on the planet. Over the course of my life, I have had the opportunity to catch a glimpse of some of these breathtaking landscapes and exceptional wildlife. Over 50 years ago, I got bushed in some of these vast landscapes and discovered just how dangerous some of the exceptional wildlife can be. Sadly, it has become all too apparent that the ecosystems I so fondly remember are changing. Ongoing fluctuations in temperature and rainfall brought about by accelerating global warming and climate change are altering habitats. Changes in average conditions greatly increase the likelihood of extreme events, such as the drought and heat waves that contributed to the 2019-2020 wildfires in southeastern Australia, with severe consequences for conservation. It has never been more apparent than now. Australia's wildlife needs protection. 30 years ago, it was a British philanthropist and entrepreneur, Martin Copley, who acted upon the alarming rate of biodiversity loss in Australia. Over the past 3 decades, one property in southwestern Australia has led to the creation of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, which now owns or manages 30 sanctuaries covering more than 6.5 million hectares or 16.1 million acres in some of the most iconic regions of Australia. This network of sanctuaries across the nation now protects more native animal species than any other non-government organisation in Australia. One of the distinguishing features of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy is its investment in science, which provides information to make its conservation activities more effective. Scientific data governs all endeavours across its sanctuaries, including proven management strategies for feral herbivores, feral predators, weeds, fire, and wildlife translocations. Every move is driven by scientific knowledge. Without the help of the Conservancy, the number of species facing extinction would be vastly greater than it currently stands. It is therefore essential for this remarkable organisation to continue its important work to protect Australia's precious biodiversity over the next 30 years and beyond. I particularly wanted, ladies and gentlemen, to send my warmest congratulations and gratitude to the Australian Wildlife Conservancy team for their outstanding work over these past 30 years. Their science-based approach and innovative land management practices are making a significant impact in protecting wildlife across Australia. I have now had the great pleasure of being patron of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy for the past 8 years, and God willing, I much look forward to celebrating your wins for Australia's wildlife for many more years to come.
So I'm here at Crackamore Wildlife Sanctuary. This is where AWC started. The journey and the story of AWC started when Martin Copley acquired this land where we are here today, 275 hectares. Put a fenced area around it, a feral predator-proof fence, eradicated feral cats and foxes, and reintroduced species, threatened species such as the quenda, the woylie, Tamar wallabies. And we've grown from that 275 hectares to where we are today, working across more than 6.5 million hectares, becoming one of the world's largest private conservation organisations. AWC is celebrating 30 years in our journey this year, in 2021. It marks an incredible milestone in the effective conservation outcomes for AWC and for Australia's natural capital. Martin started AWC 30 years ago here at Crackamore. Unfortunately, the need for an organisation like AWC is more important. In fact, it's more critical now than it had ever been in the past 30 years. We stand on the precipice of more species being threatened with extinction. I like to talk about AWC as operating across 3 decades. For the first 2 decades, AWC's growth was through the acquisition of large properties and smaller properties in southern Australia. We acquired those properties in a very strategic way, properties that were in good condition and supported a range of endemic and threatened species. The last 10 years has been more of a switch and a pivot to partnerships, recognising that a lot of the future conservation opportunities are going to come through forming partnerships with non-traditional partners. And over the last 10 years, we've formed partnerships with groups such as the Department of Defence in the Kimberley. We've formed partnerships with pastoralists at Bullo River Station. We've formed partnerships, massive partnerships with Indigenous communities and corporations. We've formed partnerships with New South Wales National Parks, managing national parks, creating feral-free fenced areas and reintroducing a suite of threatened species. The future of conservation in Australia requires more partnerships. It requires an engaged community to value our biodiversity and to support organisations like Australian Wildlife Conservancy to help secure the future of our threatened species.